Today I want to talk to you about the blessings of the Sabbath. The Sabbath day is something that a lot of churches kind of avoid or push to the side. The history of the Sabbath, the reasons why God blessed it, things of that nature. Most of Christianity completely ignores the history of the Sabbath day and why God did what he did, and why he said what he said. And probably the few churches that observe the Sabbath day, of those, the vast majority of them have made it into some kind of a legalistic thing that if you don't keep the Sabbath in a certain way, that somehow you are in rebellion against God. In fact, I'm sure all of you have heard of the Seventh-day Adventists. And the Seventh-day Adventists, you know, most Christian denominations have their sort of pet doctrine, right, that they're known for, like Baptists have the once saved, always saved thing. Well, Seventh-day Adventists are known for their keeping the seventh day as a day of rest and of worship. But they have taken it to such a legalistic extreme that, according to them, if you worship on Sunday or on any other day other than the Sabbath, that in fact, Sunday worship itself is, to them, the mark of the beast in the book of Revelation. So, I mean, you have become the Antichrist, basically, if you worship on Sunday. So you can see the extremes that we see. It's almost total neglect or into some kind of a legalistic litmus test for whether or not you're truly a Christian. And unfortunately, both of those are contrary to what the Bible says, at least with regard to us as Christians. All right, so what I want to do today is I want to examine this question of what is our responsibility to God with regard to the Sabbath day, if any. Now, the way that we typically approach a subject is that we try to lay out a case progressively, right from the beginning. We like to see where a concept was first stated and then see how it has developed throughout the scriptures and throughout history. And so that's what I want to do today with regard to the question of the Sabbath day. So let's get our Bibles out. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 2, and I first have to turn that off so that I can get my notes up here. All right, Genesis chapter 2. Let's look at where the Sabbath came from. Verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth and all the hosts of them were finished. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. Now, I have a question. Did God bless the Sabbath day before or after he rested on it? After, right? It says first God rested, and then it says, and then he blessed the Sabbath day because he rested on it. Now, question. Who's the creator?
Jesus.
Who said Jesus? Okay. What does the New Testament say about how everything was created? Well, in John chapter 1, it introduces Christ by the title Logos, or which is word in English. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. So we have this second person introduced, who is said to also be divine or deity, and that nothing was created without his direct intervention. That is, without him being the channel through which everything was accomplished. In fact, that word through, where it says all things were made through him, that word through literally means the channel of an act. That is, an agent or somebody by whom something is accomplished. If I sell my house and I hire a realtor, I can say I sold my house, but did I really sell my house, or did the realtor sell my house? Well, the realtor did the work of selling my house, right? The realtor was my agent, and that's the kind of inference that is in that preposition, through. Okay, all things were made through him. That is, the Son, or the Word, was the one through which all things were made. And we see this repeated by the Apostle Paul in Colossians chapter 1, in Hebrews chapter 1, and other places where it is stated plainly that Christ was the agent through which all things were created. So I think we are all in agreement with that. Well, here's the question. Who was it that was resting on the seventh day after everything was created? Who do you suppose was resting?
God.
What's that?
Jesus.
I think it was the Son. Now, the thing about Genesis, when we read the creation account in Genesis, all things were created in 6 days, when it talks about the creation, until we get to the creation of man, there is no indication, or no direct indication, that more than one person is involved in the creation until we get all the way down to day 6. It says, then God said, let us, plural, make man in our image and after our likeness. And so it's that statement that gives us the first concrete indication that there are more than one involved as creating all things. And that's involved in the term God. More than one person involved in this term. And so it says that God rested and ended his work which he had done. He rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day. Now, if you continue reading in Genesis, we see that, God spoke directly to Adam, apparently face to face, and he gave Adam instructions about the tree of life. You may eat of all the trees of the garden, but of the tree of tree of knowledge you shall not eat. In the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. And so then Adam and Eve sinned against God. And then it says that the Lord God was walking in the garden, and Adam and Eve were hiding from him while he's walking in the garden. And he calls out and he says to Adam, Adam, where are you? And then Adam comes, sheepishly out because he knew he was guilty. Who was walking in the garden? See, John 1:18 says that no man has seen God at any time, but then it goes on to clarify that it says the only begotten Son, the one who's in the bosom of the Father, he is the one who has made him known or declared him. Right? And so we see all these examples in the Old Testament of where it says God appeared to someone and talked to them, and it's the Son who is the one who is the agent between God and man. In fact, the New Testament says that Jesus Christ is that one mediator between God and man. And that's because God has not manifested himself directly, personally, throughout the Old Testament. He has not done that. He has always done so by his agent. And he's referred to as the messenger of the Lord and so forth throughout the books of Moses. Well, now here's the question. When God blessed the Sabbath day, what was his purpose in doing so? He did it after he rested, so it wasn't for his benefit, right? What does it mean when it says God blessed the Sabbath day and he sanctified it? What does that word sanctified mean? I heard somebody say it, I didn't. He set it apart for his own purposes, all right, for a special purpose. It was dedicated to God. Now, let me ask you this. Did God continue to rest every seventh day? Did he take every seventh day off from governing the world or all the things that he did? Did God continue to observe the Sabbath day? As far as we know, there's no record of it. In fact, when we get to the New Testament, when Jesus was accused of breaking the Sabbath, he basically said, it's my Father in me who's doing the works, right? These deeds of healing people on the Sabbath. And, the scribes and Pharisees were accusing him. He says, hey, my Father has been working until now, and I'm working. Was God taken off every Sabbath day? No. Well, what was the purpose of setting it apart at the very beginning? If not to set an example. Right? If not to set an example. The important thing is, when we start talking about the Sabbath day, to most Christians, immediately they say, oh, that's for the Jews. Well, then why didn't God set apart the Sabbath day when he gave the law? Why did he set it apart on the seventh day from the beginning of creation? Why did he do it then? It's an important question, right? It's one that deserves our contemplation. All right, look over at Genesis 1 and verse 14. It says, "Then God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for..." Now I want you to notice the signs and seasons and for days and years. Now he's talking about the sun and the moon and the stars. What is the purpose of the sun and the moon and the stars? Obviously, you know, we could say scientifically, well, we need the gravity and all this stuff. We need light. But there's another purpose. There's a more important purpose. There's an important purpose for the movement of the heavenly bodies in the way that they appear to be moving to us here on earth. From man's perspective, there's reasoning and there's intelligence behind it. What's that? God has a calendar. Now, what's important is I want you to notice these terms. He says, let them be for signs. And the word signs is the same word that's used for miraculous signs or miracles, but it's also used for allegories. When I say allegories, I mean, for example, when Joshua brought the children of Israel across the Red Sea, he was told to take 12 stones. One man from each tribe was to take a stone out of the middle of the, I'm sorry, not the Red Sea, the Jordan, into the Promised Land, to take a stone out and to carry it over to the other side, and they were to stack up this pile of stones. And he says, this is why. In generations to come, when your children say, what do these stones mean? Then you're to tell them the story. So that pile of stones represented the entire account of what God did, right? Now, that's the same word. The same word is used with regard to that pile of stones in Joshua as signs. All right, so it was a symbol that carried an important story or meaning behind it that was to be used in order to portray this meaning, right? That's what the word signs means. All right, so he's saying the stars and the sun and the moon are to be for signs. Well, that's interesting. He also says for seasons. Now, the word seasons here is not the word that we use for seasons. We think of seasons, we think of, spring and summer and fall and winter. That's not what seasons means here. The word literally means appointed times. Appointments. Set times. Now, if we continue reading through the books of Moses, that exact same Hebrew word is used throughout the books of Moses in reference to the festivals. Okay, they were the appointed times. That is the appointments where God set aside for his people to do certain things, right? Mostly with regard to worship. So he's saying that the sun and the moon and the stars are to be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. That is just to keep your normal calendar. Now, what we see in I want you to flip over to Genesis chapter 4. In verse 3, what we see is that when God set the sun and the moon and the stars and all that in the sky for those purposes, it wasn't only for what was going to happen 2,500 years later when he brought Israel out of Egypt and gave them his law. There were signs and seasons or appointed times between the creation and the time when God set his law for Israel. All right? Now I want to show you this from chapter 4 of Genesis and verse 3. It says, "And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering." Now, unfortunately, the New King James Version here doesn't give the full effect of what the Hebrews says in the first clause there, in the process of time. Literally, it says in Hebrew, at the expiration of the days. Now, what does that indicate? Does that just indicate after a while? If I say at the expiration of the days, does that indicate just any random time? Or does it indicate a set time? It indicates a set time. All right? It indicates a set time. Now, what I'm trying to do is connect that idea. Cain and Abel brought their offerings to God at a set time. What set time was that? Well, we're not told. Was that an annual set time? Was that a weekly set time? We're not told of what it was. But what we do know is that Cain and Abel brought an offering according to God's own specifications. Now, God's specifications for how this was to be done are not given to us in the text. But what we do know is that Abel met God's specifications and Cain did not. Is that right? And so God rejected Cain and his offering, but he accepted Abel and his offering. Now, what these things imply is that from the very beginning, we have Cain and Abel, Adam's sons, worshiping God according to set times and according to set procedures or specifications in how they were to worship God. Would you guys agree that that's a proper inference from these statements? Would you guys agree with that?
I will.
Okay, good. Thank you. If you agree, then we're good to go. All right, I want you to turn over to, we're still in chapter 4. Let's go down to verse 26. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Now, your Bible says, then men began to call on the name of the Lord. The word men there is in italics. It's not in the original language. The Greek version, the Septuagint, says something like, this one, that is Seth, talking about Seth, when his son was born, this one hoped, or anticipated, calling to himself the name of the Lord. If you have an old King James Version, it'll say something in the margin, if you have the marginal notes, it'll say something like, calling himself by the name of the Lord. Is that what it says? You have the old King James. All right, the Hebrew itself literally means to call to oneself. That is to surname oneself. And the Septuagint reading is really the same thing. It uses a middle voice verb for naming someone. If you name a child, it would be in the active voice because you're naming someone else. But in this case, it's in the middle voice. So you're calling to yourself a name. You're naming yourself. And so what they were doing was they were naming themselves by the name of the Lord, or calling to themselves the name of the Lord. That is, we are the children of Yahweh, the children of God. Now, it's interesting that he uses God's personal name here, because when we get to the rest of the books of Moses and we look at the covenants that God gave Israel, the name Yahweh is always God's covenantal name. What it essentially means to be a child of Yahweh means to be in a covenant relationship with God, with the God of Israel, okay? And so by using this kind of terminology, and remember Moses is writing this, and he's writing it to the Jews, right? Moses wrote these books while they were in the wilderness. He's writing about history. He's using the same terminology that he used with regard to Israel being in a covenant relationship to God. He's using the same thing with regard to Seth and so forth. So we have Abel, we have Seth, both of them being in some sort of a covenant relationship with God, honoring God's appointed times, whatever they happen to be. They're not specified here, but we do know there were some. Okay? All right, well, let's move along. Genesis chapter 26 now. Let's look at Abraham. Verse 5. Actually, let's just go back to verse 3. Okay, this is Jacob. God appearing to Jacob, which is Abraham's grandson. But look what he says to him. Let's start reading in verse 1, chapter 26, verse 1. There was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham, and Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar, and the Lord appeared to him. Sorry, Isaac, not Jacob. Excuse me. and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I will tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your," it says descendants, but it's literally seed, singular. Where was I?
3.
Thank you. To you and your seed I will give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. That oath, by the way, is in Genesis 22, when Abraham was going to offer up Isaac, and then God stopped him, and he swore this oath. Verse 4, "And I will make your descendants, or your seed, multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants, or your seed, all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed." Now notice this, "because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept," now notice these terms, "and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." Interesting. Now, these are the same terms that God used to describe the law of Moses. Now, I'm not saying Abraham had the law of Moses. He didn't. The law of Moses didn't come until after Abraham was dead. However, by using the same, excuse me, the same terminology, and I want you to notice that there are distinctions between these terms, right? It wasn't just Abraham did everything I said. Abraham kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So here's my question to you. What commandments and statutes and laws did Abraham keep? Because he died long before the law of Moses was given. So what statutes, laws, commandments did Abraham keep? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Stephen?
Whatever was not recorded that Cain and Abel were following.
That's right. Whatever, see, the fact is, there was a covenant people of God from the very beginning. People who had a contract with God, who had promises from God. Are we given all the specifics about all that? No. All we know is those people existed. We know that Abraham's ancestry in Genesis is traced back through Noah, back through Enoch, and all the way back to Seth, and all the way back to Adam, really. But he's traced back through this line that we know had a covenant relationship with God. And they had laws, they had commandments, they had statutes, and all of those things, even though we don't have all the specifics of what they were. All right, would you guys agree that that's a proper inference from these statements? There obviously were commandments, statutes, laws, etc., that Abraham was familiar with, that had been handed down to him by his ancestors. Right? All right? Let's look at Exodus chapter 16. Now we're jumping ahead all the way to the time of the Exodus. I want to start reading in chapter 16 and verse 1. This is right after Moses brought the children of Israel out of Egypt on that Passover, or right after the Passover. And it says in verse 1, "And they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt." So how long has it been since they left Egypt? Anybody know? About a month, right? How do we know that? Because the Passover was on the 14th day of the first month. And here we are in the 15th day of the second month. All right, they left Egypt on the 15th of the first month, so it's exactly a month later. "And the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, 'Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt.'" What a bunch of whiners, man. Have you guys ever noticed how many times they say this? It's amazing. And here they are. It's only been a month. It's only been a month, and they just saw the Red Sea parted, and the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud and all that, and it's, you know.
It's so hot.
Yeah.
I wish I were dead.
Yes. Well, they get their wish later. But anyway. when we sat by the pots of mead and only ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my laws or not. And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Now what I want you to notice is God is synchronizing them with the sabbatical cycle of 6 days and a 7th day. And what we can tell actually from this passage is what day of the week it was when they left Egypt, because all you have to do is backtrack 30 days and you can actually tell what day of the week the Passover fell on this particular year, which is a very interesting piece of chronological information. But anyway, let's continue. Verse 6, he says, Then Moses and Aaron said to all the children of Israel, At evening you shall know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your complaints against the Lord. But what are we that you complain against us? Also Moses said, This shall be seen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and in the morning bread to the full. For the Lord hears your complaints which you make against him. And what are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord. Now let's just skip on down a little bit. Let's go to verse 12. I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So it was that quails came up at evening and covered the camp, and the morning dew lay all around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance as fine as frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, What is this? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, This is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it according to each one's need, an omer for each person according to the number of persons. Let every man take for those who are in his tent. Let's skip down to verse 22. And so it was on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one, and all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, This is what the Lord said. Now you should underline this. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest. Now, did God institute the Sabbath day right here? No, he did it long ago at creation. So this Sabbath day had to be a continuous every 7th day all the way up until here we are 2,500 years after creation. And he says this tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath. And notice the words to the Lord. It's holy to the Lord. Why is that? Because God sanctified the day, right? Okay. And so now, verse 30 says, So the people rested on the 7th day and so forth. All right, now I want to skip down to Exodus chapter 20, and this is the giving of the law. It's the 10 Commandments. You guys are familiar with it. This is 2 weeks later. And this is the point I want you to see. When God gave the 10 Commandments to Israel, they had already been keeping the Sabbath day for 2 weeks, 2 consecutive weeks, prior to him giving the law on Mount Sinai. All right. Verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heavens and the earth. Did he say remember the Sabbath day because God gave you manna from heaven? No. He says, because in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So he appeals to what God did all the way back at creation, right? 2,500 years earlier is the reason why God says to remember the Sabbath day. Now, I want to, one more passage, and then we're going to go to the New Testament. Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23, some of you are familiar with. This is the passage where God lists all of his festivals that his people Israel are to keep. Now, I can't prove this from the Bible, but it is my suspicion that these dates, they're specific dates on the calendar that God gave to Israel, are dates that go all the way back to creation. That is, there were festivals from the very beginning on these very same dates. And yes, Moses in the law elaborated on them greatly because, you know, there was to be a priesthood and there was to be a tabernacle and there was to be all these other things that they didn't have prior to that. And so these festivals would have been greatly embellished by God under the law of Moses. But did they originate at this point under the law of Moses? I don't think so, because the very first festival that he gives that are the feasts of the Lord is the Sabbath day. And as we just showed you, God told them to start keeping the Sabbath day before he ever gave them the law. Right? So in Exodus 23 verse 1 it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, the feasts of the Lord," not the feasts of Israel, not the feasts of Moses, but the feasts of the Lord, that is the feasts of Jehovah, or Yahweh, "which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts." He doesn't say these are your feasts, these are my feasts. All right, these are my appointed times. That's what he's saying. And look at the very first one. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work in it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. These are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. On the 14th day of the first month, at twilight, is the Lord's Passover. And then he goes out, excuse me, he goes down through the rest of the chapter, and he gives all of the other annual festivals. The first festival is weekly. All of the other festivals are annual, but all of them are called the festivals of the Lord. All right? And that's the important point. And they are called, all of the festivals are called throughout the books of Moses, God's appointed times. All right? Using the very same word that we found all the way back at the beginning of Genesis when he said that he put the sun and the moon and the stars for the seasons. It's the same word. All right? For keeping track of a calendar, but not just a calendar, because an appointed time means you have an appointment on that calendar. Right? And that appointment was to meet with God on specific days and to observe specific things. All right, now we're going to jump to the New Testament and see what Jesus had to say about this topic. Let's go to Mark chapter 2. And we're going to start reading in verse 23. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And by the way, this is shortly before Passover, so this would be barley grain that they were plucking. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Now I want you to note the word lawful. What does that refer to with regard to God's commandments?
Permitted by the law of Moses.
Right, exactly. That which the law of Moses required. Whenever you see people asking Jesus about what is lawful, they're not asking him about, you know, the traffic fines or anything like that. They're always talking about what is permitted by the law of Moses or what is required by the law of Moses. And so they're telling Jesus what you're doing and what your disciples are doing is not lawful. That is, it doesn't conform to the law of Moses. Verse 25. But he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the showbread, which, now notice this, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. Now, question. You would expect that if Jesus was going to defend his disciples, and that they're accusing them of doing what is not lawful, that Jesus would have gone to Moses and showed that what they were doing was in fact lawful, and they were misunderstanding Moses. I mean, that's what we would expect. That's not what he did. He completely ignored Moses, and he ignored the law. What did he do? He said, look what David did. He did something that was not lawful for him to do. That is, he went in and he took the showbread. That was only for the priests of the tribe of Levi. David was from the tribe of Judah. He was not allowed to go in there, never mind take the bread, never mind eat the bread, never mind give it to his army, you know, his men to eat. That was unlawful, technically, from the standard of the law of Moses. Well, what was Jesus doing here? How does that... That's like, you know, if you get onto one of your children who's doing something wrong and they say, well, Joey did it, right? Is that a good justification for doing something wrong? What does Jesus' answer imply?
He's going back to first principles, ahead of the law.
That there might be something above the law? There might be something higher than the law that David knew about? Is there ever a time when the principles, the literal specifications of the law don't apply in certain situations, right? What Jesus is doing here is he's showing that David, now who's David? David was the king, the one that God chose to be king over Israel. David is the guy that God sent Nathan the prophet to give that covenant, right? The Davidic covenant, that of his seed, God was going to raise up someone to sit upon his throne, and that God was going to establish David's throne forever. And we know that that seed is Christ. The New Testament is very clear about that. And here is Christ talking about his forefather David, where God had prophesied him personally, Jesus personally. He's David's forefather. Entered into this covenant with God, and that essentially, God did not frown on David for actually circumventing the law. And that's because I believe personally David had a higher understanding of what God wanted from him personally. And so he was exempt in this particular instance. Well, look at how Jesus applies this. Verse 27, it says, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath, or Master of the Sabbath. Now, why is the Son of Man, why was Jesus the Master of the Sabbath? Why do you think? Because he's the guy who rested on it at the beginning of creation. Number one, he's the guy who instituted it from the very beginning. Isn't the person who creates everything the person who has authority over that? Isn't that right? Isn't he saying that he has authority over the Sabbath? Now, a lot of Christian denominations take that statement by Jesus and say that, well, see, Jesus had authority to cast the Sabbath day aside and substitute Sunday. But that's not what he's saying here. He's saying that the Son of Man has authority to determine how the Sabbath is to be observed, because he's the one who instituted it. All right? All right, now I wanted to point out something that, in my opinion, is irrefutable evidence for the point that I'm trying to make today. Look again at verse 27. It says, he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Now, when it's talking about the Sabbath being made for man and man being made for the Sabbath, is he talking about creation? When was man made? at the time of creation, right? In fact, the Sabbath happened the very next day, right? So when he says the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, what's missing in your translation is the definite article. It literally says the Sabbath was made for the man and not the man for the Sabbath. All right, it's twice, the man. Now, when you use the definite article, it's talking about someone very specific. Well, what man was the Sabbath made for? He's talking about when man was made, right? Right? The Sabbath and man, he's talking about these things coming into existence at the same time, right? At the same time. Which one was the priority? The man was the priority. The Sabbath was made for his benefit. So what Jesus is essentially saying here is that the Sabbath was made for Adam and not Adam for the Sabbath. You guys get that? Now, the man with the definite article can either mean Adam or it can mean humanity. That is all of mankind. That is all that has descended out of Adam. But those are the only two possible proper interpretations of the man with the definite article in this case. You guys understand what I'm saying? If Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for the man, then he was saying that the Sabbath was made for Adam, and the Sabbath was made for all of us who have come out of Adam. That's what Jesus said, because we are part of Adam. All right, you guys get that? So, when you run across Christians and they say, oh, well, the Sabbath, that's for Israel. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for Adam, for humanity, not humanity made for the Sabbath. All right, so was it made for Israel? Sure. But it was made for everybody. That's the point. Now, here's something that we need to clarify. You know, we talked, Johnny talked this morning about, you know, Jews' obligation to the law and all that, but none of us, as far as I know, are Jews. Any Jews here, as far as you know? We're all Gentiles. So, the teaching in the New Testament is pretty clear that as Gentiles and Christians, that we do not have an obligation to keep all the laws of the Mosaic covenant. You guys would agree with that, I think, right? However, because the Sabbath did not originate with Moses, it originated at the beginning. And Jesus himself said that the Sabbath was made for humanity. Then that claim that, oh, that's for Israel is rubbish. It's rubbish. All right? It was for humanity. We have Jesus' words to prove that. Also, when Jesus says that he is the Lord, or literally master of the Sabbath, we as Christians call Jesus our Lord and our master, do we not? And if he calls himself the master of the Sabbath, do we think the Sabbath has no importance to him or to us? I think that's a mistake. All right? Now, I want to turn to Matthew chapter 12. Let's go back a little bit. More of Jesus' comments. The cat's behind me. I think that's the first time I've had a cat wandering around while I was speaking. Although I have had a dog in church before, but that's different. That's a topic for another day. Matthew chapter 12, let's look at verse 10. It says, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him. That, of course, these were the Jewish leaders. And he said to them, what man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will he lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Isn't that interesting? And then he goes and he heals this man. Now this is interesting because Jesus is saying that, what he's essentially saying is that the restrictions on working on the Sabbath even in the law, do not forbid doing good. They do not forbid doing the works of God on the Sabbath day. They forbid your normal occupation. That's what they forbid. All right? So I wanted to point that out. Now, let's go to Luke chapter 23. Let's look at after Jesus taught his disciples for 3.5 years. And remember, Jesus was teaching them for three and a half years for the purpose of sending them out to all the nations to preach the gospel. Isn't that right? And he said to them to baptize them, and he said to teach them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. That is the disciples. So all that Jesus taught his disciples was to be then carried out to the nations and proclaimed to the nations by those disciples. And so this 3.5 years is an intense training period for them. And what we find throughout this 3.5 years is continually Jesus and the disciples observing the Sabbath day. Now, they did it in ways, as I just pointed out, that some of the leadership objected to. However, they did observe the Sabbath. He went into the synagogue on the Sabbath, and so forth. All right, now, let's look at this passage in Luke chapter 23, verse 56. This is after Jesus was crucified on the day of his crucifixion, which was a Friday. They were hurrying to get his body off the cross that they might get it in the grave, because the Sabbath day was about to begin as soon as the sun set, and they didn't want to work on the Sabbath, as far as burying on the Sabbath would be forbidden, right? So it says, then they returned and prepared spices and fragrant oils, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. Now on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, and so forth, then we have the women coming to the tomb. Now, who was it that rested on the Sabbath day? And notice it says according to the commandment. Who did that? Who rested on the Sabbath day?
The women that were following.
Who else? Who else? Jesus rested on the Sabbath. He rested in the tomb. And he rested from just before sundown, when the Sabbath started, until shortly after the Sabbath ended and the first day of the week began, and then he got up. Jesus rested on the Sabbath. And I think that's interesting. You know, God could have orchestrated everything so that Jesus died on a Tuesday and, you know, was in the tomb on a Thursday or a Wednesday or something. But he didn't. He had him crucified and taken off the cross and put in the tomb, and he literally observed the Sabbath. And what's funny is that the Bible refers to death, as far as believers are concerned, as sleep and as rest. We see this in Revelation, especially, where it says, he talks about blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, that they may rest from their labors, and their works will follow, or their works follow them. That is, they'll be rewarded when they are awakened from that rest. And so it wasn't only the disciples, and it wasn't only the women who rested on that Sabbath day, but Jesus himself also rested on that Sabbath day. Now, you can read anything you want into that. I'm just reading into what I think. Okay, again, it's just an inference, so I can't prove anything from it, but what I'm trying to show you is a continuity in the Bible. Now, if you ask somebody, your typical Christian, about, you know, what day you should worship on, well, it should be Sunday. And why? Well, because, you know, in the New Testament they worshipped on Sunday. Oh, really? Where? See, there is no record of that in the New Testament. Not worshiping weekly on Sunday. Is there a record of them gathering on a Sunday? Yes. It's in Acts chapter 20, but what were they doing? They were celebrating the annual festival of first fruits, which was the anniversary of Jesus' resurrection. So when they worshiped on a Sunday, it happened to be that the festival of first fruits was always on a Sunday, and Jesus was resurrected on the festival of first fruits. And so they met and they gathered together on that day in honor of Jesus' resurrection. But my point is that it was an annual gathering to celebrate an anniversary of Jesus' resurrection. There is no instance anywhere in the New Testament where any of the disciples of the apostles met on Sundays as a regular occurrence for worship or rest or anything else. Okay? It's a fact. Now, I just want to look at a couple more passages, and I know I'm going a little long, but I want to complete this. Let's go to Acts chapter 13. I'm not going to read all that I had marked out because I will keep you here too long. But in Acts chapter 13, verses 14 through 16, we see that the Apostle Paul was teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and then word got out that he was proclaiming salvation to the Gentiles. And if you skip down to verse 44, I want you to notice what it says. On the next Sabbath, almost the whole city came together to hear the word of God. But when the Jews saw the multitude, they were filled with envy and contradicting and blaspheming and opposing the things spoken by Paul, and so they began to persecute him. We have other instances in Acts, in chapter 18. You don't need to turn there. You can jot it down if you want to. Acts 18, 4 through 11. We have another instance where Paul started by entering the synagogue on the Sabbath day and teaching until they threw him out. And when they threw him out, he took those few Jews who had embraced the message, and he went next door, and he started the first Christian church, if you want to call it that. And they continued to meet on the Sabbath. Now, there's certain language in that passage that makes it pretty clear. It says that Paul, it literally says in the Greek, it's not in our English version, but it literally says that Paul sat there for, I think it was 1 year and 6 months or something like that, teaching them. And that word sat was a term that was used for the rabbis in the synagogue. In fact, you may remember on another occasion, it says that Paul and Barnabas went into the synagogue and they sat down. And then the text says, then the ruler of the synagogue says to them, men and brothers, if you have something to say, speak up. Well, the reason it says they sat down was because there were special seats. They were called the chief seats in the synagogue, and they were reserved for those people who were like itinerant evangelists or things like that, and who had the proper qualifications to be able to address the whole congregation in the synagogue. And so Paul went and sat in those seats, and when he did, he was invited to address the whole assembly. And in this particular passage in chapter 18 of Acts, it literally says that after Paul had been teaching in the synagogue and then he was ejected, that they went next door into a person's house, and then it says Paul sat and taught them for another, I forget how many months it was. All right, but the point is that term that he sat is a Jewish idiom for what the rabbis did at the synagogues. And the implication is that what Paul had been doing at the synagogue on the Sabbath day, after he got thrown out, they established a Christian synagogue, if you will, and Paul continued doing the same he was doing there. We see he evangelized Gentiles on the Sabbath. He taught the Gentiles on the Sabbath. There is no instance in the New Testament where anyone met for worship, met for instruction, for worship, or anything of the kind regularly on any day of the week other than the Sabbath day. All right, that is the consistent precedent that we have. Now, when we come to the kingdom of God, which we are looking forward to, in Isaiah 66, 22 through 23, it says that during the kingdom, and of course, we have a major part to play in the kingdom. We are going to be kings and priests and so forth in the kingdom. But in Isaiah 66, 22 and 23, it says that from one Sabbath to another and from one new moon to another, that all flesh is going to come and worship before God. And when he mentions Sabbaths, we know what that is. When he mentions new moons, that's how they calculated all the other festivals. It was based on the new moon. All right, they were so many days from the new moon on any particular month. All right, so he's talking about the festivals of the law of Moses. He's talking about the Sabbath day as being, continuing to be celebrated in the coming kingdom. And then finally, the point I want to make is that in Hebrews chapter 4, and I know most of you are probably familiar with this passage, but the Apostle Paul refers to the kingdom itself as being the Sabbath. He talks about the, in fact, he ties it in to Genesis, where God says that, you know, he created everything in 6 days and he rested on the Sabbath. And he talked about us entering into that rest. That is the permanent Sabbath for us. And of course, the Apostle John refers to the kingdom, the millennium, as being 1,000 years. And we know that there's 6 days, 6,000 years. And then the seventh day is the kingdom, is the Sabbath. So we see that same cycle being repeated not only on a daily or weekly basis, but also on a millennial basis. The kingdom is the Sabbath. And he refers to that in Hebrews chapter 4 as us entering the kingdom, as us entering into God's rest. See, when God sanctified the seventh day, all the way back at creation, it was prophetic of ultimately the kingdom of God that's going to come to earth after 6 millennia of years, and then 1,000 years of Christ's reign upon the throne of David. So we have the Sabbath. He calls it the rest, just like all the other terminology in the scriptures. All right, so we see this consistent pattern that is from beginning to end in the Bible, and it's all about this 6 days plus the seventh day. It's repeated over and over and over and over again. And I'm going to close with one passage of scripture. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 58. Now, in Isaiah 58, God is rebuking Israel for their hypocrisy and so forth. But I want you to, and the fact that they fast and they do all these different things, but yet they're not living according to God's will. Get down to verse 6. He says, "Is this not the fast that I have chosen?" Wait a minute. Actually, let me go back to the beginning of the chapter. "Cry aloud, spare not, lift up your voice like a trumpet. Tell my people their transgression, and the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily, and delight to know my ways, as a nation that did righteousness, and did not forsake the ordinance of the law. They ask of me the ordinances of justice. They take delight in approaching God. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen? And why have we afflicted our souls, and you take no notice? In fact, in the day of your fast you find pleasure, and exploit all your laborers. Indeed, you fast for strife and debate, and to strike with the fist of wickedness. You will not fast as you do this day, to make your voice heard on high. Is this a fast that I have chosen, a day for a man to afflict his soul? Is it to bow down his head like a bulrush, and to spread out sackcloth and ashes? Would you call this a fast, an acceptable day to the Lord? Is this not the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring into your house the poor who are cast out? Now, what God is doing here is he's chastising Israel because they're going through the motions. They're going through the religious motions of fasting and, you know, going to the appointed feasts and all this kind of stuff, but their hearts are wicked before God. And so God is saying, you know, when I ask you to fast, am I asking you just to, you know, not eat? Isn't there a reason behind it? And so he starts talking about the real reasons behind what his commandments are. Verse 7, is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring into your house the poor who are cast out? When you see the naked, that you cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh? Then your light will break forth like morning, and your healing will spring forth speedily. And your righteousness shall go before you, and the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard." Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and he will say, Here I am. If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger, the speaking wickedness, if you extend your soul to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted soul, then your light shall dawn in the darkness, and your darkness shall be as the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your soul in drought. And strengthen your bones. You shall be like a watered garden, and like springs of water whose waters do not fail. How many of us want that? I think we all want that. Don't we all feel parched spiritually from time to time? Those from among you shall build the old waste places. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. And you shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets to dwell in. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words. That is, it's God's day. God sanctified the day. He set it apart for us to rest, but also to be remembering him and what he has done in his creation and so forth. And instead, what were they doing? They were doing their own pleasure on God's holy day. And God, he was angry with them. He was angry with them. They didn't understand God's heart. Then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. Now, I want to make a point very clear before I end my sermon. I started by telling you my sermon title is The Blessings of the Sabbath. Under the law of Moses, there were blessings for the Sabbath. We just read some of the blessings that God attached to keeping the Sabbath. Under the law of Moses, there was both blessings and cursings. Isn't that right? You read Deuteronomy 28 and 29. It's very clear there were blessings and cursings. If you kept God's commandments, there were blessings. If you disregarded God's commandments, there were curses. That's under the law of Moses. Again, we as Christians are not under the obligation of the law of Moses, at least Gentiles. However, there are blessings attached to the Sabbath because God established it at the beginning. There is nowhere else that I know of in the Bible where there are curses for people who disregard the Sabbath, except in the law of Moses. It applies to that specific covenant. So what is my point? My point is that observing the Sabbath has blessings and has always had blessings from the very beginning. Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for man's benefit. All right? There are blessings to observing the Sabbath. It is God's holy day. Do we have curses for not observing the Sabbath as Christians? Not that I can find in the Bible. Now, why do you suppose that is? And why do you suppose that in the New Testament, when Jesus sent the apostles out to proclaim the gospel, he did not tell them, make sure you tell those new Christians to keep the Sabbath day. He didn't do that. Why do you suppose that is? Anybody know?
They were used to it. There was no reason you had to.
I'm sorry?
They were already doing it.
You would expect there to be some sort of a command. I mean, we have examples, but we don't have a command. Well, here's the thing that a lot of people don't realize. A 7-day week was not universal at the time. Now, in our day, pretty much everybody around the world is observing a 7-day week, and that's mostly because of Roman Catholicism. That's one of the things they did good, is that as far as having a calendar that is based on a 7-day cycle. All right. However, during Roman times, there were times when they had a 8-day week. There were times when they had a 10-day week. There were some other cultures that didn't have a week. There were some cultures that actually, on their calendar, they divided up into months based on the lunar cycle, and then they just divided the month up into, divided it up into weeks, but they were not 7 days. They tried to round it off so they had even Numbers, and so forth. And then at the next month, they would start the cycle over again. So the idea of a continuous 7-day cycle, all the way back from creation, was not something that was followed universally in all the nations. Now, when Jesus sent his apostles out to preach the gospel to the nations, he was sensitive, and the apostle Paul was sensitive to the customs of the nations, and not to impose things on the nations that were not necessary with regard to their relationship with God. All right? He only insisted that they follow certain things. In fact, the Jerusalem Council said of the Gentiles, right, that they were to avoid fornication and things strangled and things like that. They didn't mention anything about keeping the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day was not universally kept throughout the Roman Empire at the time. If they had given a command, it would have been an impediment to the spread of the gospel. And this is my opinion. I'm giving this as my opinion, okay? Why that was left out. However, what we do have from the beginning of the Bible to the end is only the Sabbath day, in all kinds of ways, being taught by God from the very beginning, being commanded under the law of Moses, being kept by Jesus and his apostles. Even throughout their missionary journeys, the Apostle Paul and the other apostles were clearly keeping the Sabbath day. So the examples that we have are consistent from beginning to end. And in my opinion, if God had said, you know what, scrap the Sabbath thing, let's just go to Sundays, then we would see that kind of thing in the kingdom. But we don't. In the kingdom, what do we see? Worshiping God on the Sabbath day. In the kingdom. All right, so it would be like God said, forget that. Oh, now I've changed my mind, let's bring it back. You know, it seems kind of odd that God would be jerking people around like that. He set a pattern. It's for man's benefit. He clearly attached blessings to keeping the Sabbath. And so, bottom line is, I would encourage you to try it and see if blessings come. How about that? That's a challenge. See if blessings come. I can tell you from experience, Diane and I have been doing this for months now, several months. Keeping the Sabbath, not working on the Sabbath, even when we reach a point where we feel like, how in the world are we going to get everything done if we don't work on the Sabbath day? And what we have found is that God has, the phrase Diane likes to use, he's increased our capacity, and we end up getting more done than we thought we could possibly get done in less time. So, I'm just telling you what we're doing, our reasoning for doing it. I'll leave it entirely up to you. Again, as far as I know, there's no curse for not keeping the Sabbath for Christians. But I see that there's a blessing. And so, how many of us couldn't use God's blessings? Walking by faith is part of it. It's part of walking by faith. All right, which I'm going to be talking about walking by faith on Friday. But anyway, that's it. Any questions or comments?
Well, something, I mean, practically something like for our assembly, like I work, we have firefighter, me and two other guys are firefighters in our assembly. We work on Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's no way around it. We have to man the fire station 24 hours. So sometimes we meet on the Sabbath, sometimes we meet on Fridays, sometimes we meet on Sundays. How practically does this happen? You know what I mean? I don't see...
Well, again, I don't see a curse attached to it. But I think that people who... I mean, there's some situations where you just cannot avoid it.
I mean, I Sabbath for 48 hours after I work for 24.
All right, well, let me put it this way. I'm not going to judge anybody's particular situations, okay? I'm not going to judge that. What I'm saying is, if what I'm telling you here is true, you should be able to test it, and it should work for you. And sometimes testing something requires taking a leap of faith. That's all I'm saying. I found the same thing to be true sometimes, you know, when we talk about tithing and things of that nature. People say, I can't afford it. Well, try it. See what happens. Is there a blessing? Does God step up? Check it out. All right, yes.
Tim, have you considered changing your worship to being on the seventh day?
We do that here.
You do.
Yes. Yeah. Now, but some of the fellowships meet on different days. So we don't dictate what other fellowships do. That's up to them. Our fellowship here, we meet on Saturdays.
So do you feel guilty when you work on Sunday?
No. You know why? Because God said, 6 days you shall work. If I took Sunday off, I'd be working 5. Yes, Steve.
Excuse me. Back in Mark, where you're pointing out that in verse 27, the definite article
Mm-hmm.
was excluded, right?
What do you mean it's excluded? No, it's included in the Greek.
It's included in the Greek, but excluded from the...
From our English translations, yes.
So in verse 28, the following verse where it says, therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath, at least according to the source I'm looking up here, the definite article is in front of man here as well. So therefore it would be, therefore the Son of the Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath.
Well, that has to do with the rules of the definite article when you're using genitive clauses like that. The Son of Man is a genitive clause.
So it forces
That's not.
the use of the definite article.
What's that?
That forces the use of the definite article in that case?
Not necessarily. No.
Okay, so
But-
let
No,
me
go
ask
ahead.
my question,
Yes.
and then you can fix whatever my wrong thinking is. I actually have two thoughts here. One is if saying the Son of the Man refers back to the man that was mentioned in the fire verse being added, could that be pointing back to Genesis 3:15, where we have the first mention of the gospel where the seed was going to bruise the serpent?
I think that talks about the seed of the woman. The Son of Man is a technical title that's used for Jesus to point out his humanity. I wouldn't read any more than that into it.
Okay, so that brings me to the second question then. If Jesus is kind of pulling the trump card, why is he not saying in that particular verse, the Son of God is the Lord of the Sabbath rather than the Son of Man? He's pointing to his humanity rather than his divine person.
He's the same person.
I get that.
Yeah.
But where's the connection between appealing to his humanity in saying that he is the Lord of the Sabbath because he is the Son of Man? Do you understand what I'm trying to pass?
I don't really see the significance. He is both. He used both titles repeatedly in reference to himself.
Right.
So when he says the Son of Man, he was human when he was here, and he's basically saying that he has full authority over the Sabbath.
Yeah, but isn't
So-
that phrase, the Son of Man, can that not be used of any human?
Yeah,
So
yeah, but he's referring to himself in particular, not to just any human.
Right.
So I don't see where you're going with it.
Maybe I'll just miscommunicate with him.
Okay, well, if you want, we can talk more about it, but I don't really see the importance of it. But okay. Anybody else?
I would just say that for me, the kind of ultimate trump card as far as how I view the Sabbath has to do with, if this is pointing to the millennial kingdom, that will be a Sabbath rest that I don't want to skip. Or don't want to miss.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Why would I argue? I mean,
Why would you argue about the weekly Sabbath, right?
yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. But that's our hope. I mean, the whole point really for me and for us, for Diane and I anyway, when we observe the Sabbath, is we are doing it in anticipation of that ultimate Sabbath after 6,000 years of humanity, of work and toil under the curse, and then to be able to rest from that. To me, it's prophetic every single week, and it's very meaningful for us. And all I'm doing is inviting you guys to try it and see how meaningful it becomes for you as well. It has become extremely meaningful for us as the more we have done it. And the more we have said, you know what, even though we can't seem to get all our work done, we're going to rest anyway. And God seems to have honored that in ways that are pretty remarkable, I think. So,